Good evening. Tonight, the government unveils its plan to try and cut net migration by 300,000 a year. It feels to me that in Westminster recently, we've had more heat than light. Well, today was a big day because finally, we've got some actual policy. Finally, something to get our teeth stuck into. In the House of Commons today, the Home Secretary James Cleverly announced a 5-point plan to reduce immigration levels, including banning care workers from bringing their families to the UK and raising the minimum salary that you need to get a skilled worker visa. He said that last year it would have stopped 300,000 people coming here. That's according to the Home Secretary. Now, you're going to hear different voices on the show tonight, some saying it's a good idea, some will say that it's a bad idea. But after weeks of talking about immigration, I guess at least we've got a policy now on it, even if we're still a long way away from David Cameron promising to cut net migration to the tens of thousands. It did get me thinking, though, because we have spent a lot of time talking about immigration, haven't we? Which is a bit weird, because Rishi Sunak didn't even mention bringing down levels of legal migration in his conference speech. The only thing in there was a passing reference to stopping the boats, which is a very different policy area. So it does feel like today's policy announcement today has been driven by events, so those record net migration figures that we got, rather than a long-term strategy. Of course, in the end, the important thing will be whether or not the measures announced today make any difference. You see, that's the trouble with migration numbers. They have a nasty habit of not doing what they're told. Just ask David Cameron. Well, today we are going to be talking an awful lot about those numbers, and in particular, the numbers that caused today's big announcement. I think we can have a quick look at the chart I've got on the screen next to me, because as you can see, it is not going down much at all. It's been going up, and it's not set to be going down much before the next election either. So we're going to be discussing the repercussions of that in the first part of tonight's show. We'll be hearing from our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates. We're also going to be hearing from other people on the programme too, from the world of business and also from the world of politics as well, from both Labour and the Conservatives. First, though, here's our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates.
Cutting immigration, a Conservative pledge for more than a decade, starting with him.
Net migration to this country will be in the order of tens of thousands each year. No ifs, no buts.
Repeated by her.
We do want to bring net migration down to sustainable levels. We believe that is the tens of thousands.
And from him too.
Can you guarantee that numbers will come down?
Yes, I can make sure that numbers will come down.
Every promise broken. After record immigration figures last month, Tory backbenchers have run out of patience. They believe the voters have too. The new Home Secretary says his plan is different.
Migration to this country is far too high and needs to come down. And today we are taking more robust action than any other government before in order to bring this down. Ukraine.
The answer, a new 5-point clampdown on legal migration.
We will stop overseas care workers from bringing family dependents. We will increase the skilled worker earnings threshold by a third to 38,700 from next spring.
Health and care workers will be exempt from that threshold. Tougher rules too for family visas.
We will ensure people only bring dependents who they can support financially by raising the minimum income for family visas to the same threshold as the minimum salary threshold for skills workers, which is 38,700.
Secretary Yvette Cooper.
Labour say this is a mess of the government's own making.
Today's statement is an admission of years of total failure by this Conservative government, failure on the immigration system and failure on the economy. It is another example of the total chaos at the heart of this government.
This government says this all adds up to a 300,000 cut in annual immigration.
300,000 down. That means you're abandoning the 2019 manifesto target. You've abandoned the promise.
Well, what we have done is we have taken a very significant step, the largest single step in reform of an immigration system that this country has ever seen, and doing so in a way that protects the growth in the UK economy
New Home Secretary James Cleverly appears to have bought himself some breathing space with his package on legal migration, which seems to have gone down well with his own side. But a new clash could just be days away. Just how far are he and Rishi Sunak prepared to go ripping up international agreements in order to bring down illegal migration and stop the boats?
So today was a really positive step forward on legal migration. I commend the government on going far as it has done, but of course there's always more room to go. On illegal migration, it has to be very clear. We have to make sure that where we need to disapply sections of the Human Rights Act, we do it. That we need to make sure that we completely ignore what any Strasbourg court rules, because this is a sovereign parliament. We make the laws of our land.
Immigration, increasingly the topic that will define Rishi Sunak's premiership. Illegal migration, the next fight in the days to come. Can he turn the tide? Sam Coates, Sky News.
Well, Sam joins us now. It feels like it's gone down pretty well with Conservative MPs. How's it gone down elsewhere?
That's right, Sophie. We often talk about migration in terms of the reception of the Conservative Party, but the Conservative Party isn't Britain. And there's been a lot of other reaction. There's been a lot of business reaction. I mean, the NHS providers, which oversees parts of the NHS, called it concerning, because they've got lots and lots of vacancies. I was quite struck by the response of UK Hospitality, which is the sort of industry body for that group. They say that 95% of people who got visas under one route would no longer be eligible. This is skilled chefs. They were saying, where do you get them from? I asked the Home Secretary an hour ago, are you just going to make pensioners become skilled chefs? He said there is capacity in our workforce to replace some of the skills that you're not going to get from abroad. But I think, as you could hear from bits of the business community, there is a sort of hit to growth. I wouldn't be surprised if the OBR looks at 300,000 fewer next year and downgrades slightly the growth forecasts, because they didn't know about this at the time of the autumn statement. And really, that brings it to sharp relief, because we had two big events on growth today. You'll find out a bit more later about the one done by Keir Starmer on growth, but slightly different paths, slightly different kind of visions. But I just want to get to a different party political point on all of this. Where is Labour? Now, they like to say the government is too slow. They like to sound critical of the way that government is going about it. But it was quite noticeable today, Sophie. I didn't find them objecting to any part of what the government was proposing. They said they haven't fully made up their mind, need to look away. But through the word salad that we occasionally got from some people, it appears to be that Labour, at least if not quite endorsing, then don't object to any of this. That's quite an interesting position when you had thought there might be an easy difference to tell on two parties on growth. Maybe it's not quite so straightforward.
Interesting. We might learn a little bit more on that when we talk to Steve Reed later on as well. Sam, thank you very much indeed. Well, as we've been hearing from Sam just there, there's been a lot of concern raised tonight from business groups in the care and hospitality sectors who are warning the changes will create further staff shortages. Well, we can talk now to Lord Bilimoria, who is president of the business group. The CBI has also had a very illustrious business background as well, founder of Cobra Beer, for example, as well. Thank you for being with us. What's your take then? What's your reaction to the announcement on net migration?
This is a very worrying situation where every sector of the economy, including the hospitality sector, is short of workforce and labour and needs to recruit people. And we need to bring them in from abroad. Skilling people domestically takes time. But the deal with the government after we left the European Union and the points-based system was, if there are shortages in sectors, then the shortage occupation list would be activated and we'd be able to bring in the workforce we require from around the world. And it's every sector, whether it's agricultural workers, hospitality, technology, let alone the health service, there are shortages everywhere. And what is so misleading, and nobody points this out, is the net migration figure includes international students. International students are not immigrants. Technically, they're counted as immigrants because anyone who stays for 1 year, a one-year master's student is counted as an immigrant. But other countries like America and Australia treat them as temporary migrants and exclude them from the figures. If you take international students out of the net migration figure, this figure of 670,000, 750,000 gets reduced by hundreds of thousands. People don't realize that. And then suddenly it's not as scary a figure as is being made out to. And the government just will not listen to this. I brought this up in the House of Lords many, many times, and they were refusing to take out students from the net migration figures. And if you do that, you could then bring in the workforce that every sector in this economy desperately needs.
I take your point on the student figures, but as you say, it will reduce by a few 100,000. It's still an awful long way from the kind of tens of thousands that we were promised by David Cameron all those many moons ago. What do you make of the specific policy to exclude the dependents of care workers, for example? Because that's something that many Conservative MPs think is rather a good thing because it will help relieve pressure on public services.
If you exclude dependents for something like the care sector, and the care sector is the Cinderella sector in the whole health area, it's very difficult to recruit staff anyway. They don't get paid very much. And if you stop them bringing in their dependents, you're going to, again, create an acute shortage for an area that is already struggling. The hospitality sector, dependents don't matter as much, but you need a threshold of £40,000, nearly £40,000 is going to make it unaffordable for the hospitality sector. My business, we supply 7,000 restaurants. They're already fighting with their hands tied behind their backs with COVID and with the Ukraine war and the cost of living crisis, one thing after another, business rates being one of the highest in Europe, and now you can't recruit people that you need. I'm sorry, good immigration has been good for this country. We wouldn't be the 6th largest economy in the world without the 15% ethnic minorities who are now reaching the very top, let alone the Prime Minister of this country. Why are we hampering good immigration when we should be focusing on the illegal immigration that everyone agrees needs to be stopped, and they should be making every effort to do that? Don't stop the good immigration, let alone harm international students that bring in £42 billion to this economy and are one of our strongest elements of soft power. In the whole world, as we speak, along with America, half the world's leaders have been educated in British or American universities, with the rest of the countries in the world making up the other 50%. That's how powerful it is. It's priceless. We should be appreciating it, not hampering it.
What do you think is going on then, taking what you say on merit? Do you think that the Prime Minister just doesn't get business, or do you think that he's playing to the gallery, trying to play politics instead?
There is this attitude and impression, and it goes back to Brexit. One of the main reasons that Brexit happened in 2016 was in 2015 you had the awful immigration coming over from the crisis in the Middle East and the tragedies in the Mediterranean, and Angela Merkel saying that she would let in 1 million people. That fear of large-scale immigration is one of the fears that led to Brexit. And there's always been this fear created about immigration. Instead of talking about immigration that's good immigration, a positive light, and appreciating it, that's what we should be doing.
I just want to ask you about the CBI finally, if I may, because obviously it has been a difficult period, shall we say, for the CBI, and our city editor, Mark Kleiman, reporting that you're going to be putting up subscriptions. Is this an organisation under pressure?
The CBI has been through a very, very difficult time since March this year. That is absolutely open knowledge. We've had an extraordinarily challenging time. I was president for 2 years until June 2022. And as the tradition is, I've stayed on the board as vice president until now. I'm still on the board until later this week when I'll be stepping down. All I can say is through this challenging period, the CBI has made huge reforms and is now very much back on a good footing financially. Membership is the members who suspended have been rejoining. Government engagement has started. We had a major conference where the chancellor spoke, the shadow business secretary spoke. So government engagement now is on as before. So the CBI is getting back to being the preeminent business organisation in this country and the voice of British business, not just in the UK, but on the global stage as well. And I'm very relieved and happy that I'm stepping down from the board at a time when it's in a good, strong position going forward with a secure future.
OK, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for being on the programme this evening. Right, let's bring in our duo for this evening, shall we? The former government special advisor, Salma Shah, and Andrew Fisher, who was director of policy for the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. Good to have you both on the show today. Right, we're talking net migration. First of all, should we be looking to cut levels of net migration in the first place? Andrew, what do you think?
No, and I think today's announcements are an extraordinary act of self-harm. This will do immense damage to our economy and to public services and to parts of the private sector as well, as Lord Bilimoria was setting out there. If we cut the number of care workers able to come to this country, then that means more people are going to have to spend time looking after their elderly relatives, looking after disabled relatives who can't get care. There's already a shortage of care for people through the local authorities at the moment. So there's already a lot of people who are unable to work the amount of hours you would want them to, earn enough, pay enough tax, go out to work themselves, and having to look after relatives. So it's a real cost to all of us. Plus, do we want our elderly and disabled people to be neglected because there aren't enough care workers? You know, if you listen to Age UK, they say there are 2.5 million people in this country with unmet care needs, you know, already now. So if we reduce this number, it's going to make that situation for them a lot worse. And that's just in the care sector.
Salma, what do you think?
So, I mean, I can't actually disagree with what Andrew's saying. I think the difficulty here is that there's clearly a political advantage to talking about immigration in these terms. And I think the problem has always been that they've used this figure, this headline figure of net migration, to try and tell an immigration story about the UK.
It's high. It is high, though, isn't it? You know, like we're around 700.
So we're looking at it as high.
Record.
But don't forget, we are in an environment where we now no longer have freedom of movement. So we're now increasing the numbers as a fact that we're looking at this migration that was never recorded previously, that we're now going to see in the figures. We've had record increases in refugee applicants coming in from Ukraine and Hong Kong. And Afghanistan, indeed, as well. So I think it's important to be able to look at these numbers in that context. But again, it's rudimentary. It doesn't actually tell you the economic story. It doesn't tell you the social story about immigration in the UK. And if you were able to go underneath those numbers and try and understand, you know, where is the downward pressure that's created by cheap migrant in the country and what sectors are being affected by that, you'd see a completely different picture. So, you know, when I was in the Home Office, polling showed us actually most people aren't worried about student migration because there was a very successful clampdown on fraudulent colleges that were, you know, actually problematic, you know, at the time. And Theresa May, as Home Secretary, was very effective in dealing with that. So student migration numbers, I agree that we should bring them into international comparators and remove them from our net migration figures. However, the reason it's politically potent is that there are issues in terms of social and cultural clashes, in terms of difficulties, in terms of integration. But that's not necessarily the same issue that you're facing in terms of economic migration. I think the distinctions are unclear and therefore policy doesn't deal with it effectively.
So what's going on here then, right? You know, you think you've got a balanced panel, like someone from Labour, someone from the Conservatives, and you're both saying effectively the opposite of what your parties are, because there is unity, isn't there, in both Conservatives and the Labour Party saying they want to bring down those figures.
I think there's a dishonest game being played here, and it's driven by the media and it's driven by weak politicians who aren't prepared to stand up to it.
Including
By the media.
Keir Starmer, then,
I mean, yes, definitely. The Labour Party for years has been incredibly weak on this and failed to take on an argument about migration. In fact, when Keir Starmer was running for leader, he said, I think Labour's being too cowardly on this. We ought to be putting forward the positive case for migration, which did happen for 4 years under Jeremy Corbyn, but broadly. But has faded away now since because he thinks there's a political advantage in playing to try and get Tory voters and Brexit voters and Reform voters and so on. But actually, we need to be honest with people. We need to tell the real story. Look, if we stopped student migration tomorrow, most universities in this country would go bust because that's the economic model that's been set up since 2013. We took away public funding, we hiked up fees, and we said the shortfall will be met by trying to get more international students. If you clamp down on that, and partly we will do that by not letting them bring independence, then you will reduce those figures and you will see institutions go bust. If you want to tackle the shortages in the NHS and get down those massive waiting lists that we've been talking about for months now, you need to bring in more skilled nurses, doctors, healthcare assistants. You need to get more care workers in because often people can't be discharged from hospital because there isn't the safe care system for them to go into.
Let's talk about the politics for a minute, shall we? Because it's pretty clear, isn't it, that Rishi Sunak sees this as a key dividing line. He's perhaps worried about reform. He thinks that it's something that the Conservatives can gain trust on. Do you think it's a sensible political position, I guess, Salma?
I think the problem with it is that if he takes this political position, he's going to have lots of criticism coming back at him from business. And when people are very worried about the economy and you've got senior significant business leaders actually talking about the fact that this is going to be net problematic for them, and you're going to see businesses, you know, particularly in the hospitality sector, shut down because they don't have the right kind of staff, you're going to create a ripple effect that's going to affect, you know, everyone that's here. So you might think that you can have a strong political line, but ultimately the outcome of that policy is going to be a net negative result, and the reality of that is not good for you politically.
Okay. Really interesting to talk. Thank you very much indeed, Sam and Andrew. Lots more from them on the programme. Stay with us. Coming up next on the Politics Hub, because a big part of today's announcement was trying to calm down Conservative backbenchers who've been calling for the government to urgently do something on net migration. We are going to be talking to one of them in a moment. Brendan Clarke-Smith joins us next.
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home. You must not meet socially in groups of more than 6, and if you do, you will be breaking the law. There was no party, and that no COVID rules were broken. The reason there's no evidence to show that I must have known, or I must have believed that illegal events were taking place is because I didn't.
We use the Newfoundlands for emotional support. So we take military veterans, emergency service staff, people with disabilities, and anybody who wants a fun swim, swimming in open water with the dogs, and the results are just amazing, just incredible.
So tell me what he does. He goes swimming with them?
Yeah, he swims with people, yeah. So what we do is we get people turn up, whether we have 6 at a time. We get them in a wetsuit, buoyancy aid, dry suit, whatever. We swim out 30, 40 metres. The dogs then swim out to us and he pulls them back to shore. Everything we do is so simple, but it's massively effective.
What is it about dogs?
It's the loyalty, the comradeship, it's everything about them. The fact that they want to be with you all the time. You can leave the house for 5 minutes and come back in wagging the tails. You can leave the house for 4 hours, the same thing. They're just so pleased and so loyal and just brilliant.
And they calm people, don't they?
Absolutely, these do. I mean, he's probably saved himself probably a couple of lives by his demeanour with people. So as you saw, then he puts his head on my lap now. He tends to find people that are in a bad place and he'll sit with them. When we're actually in the water, and because we have people sat in the water with them, so we've got like a pat dog in the water while they're waiting for their turn to swim. If someone's got a bit of an issue, he tends to find it, and he puts his paws on the shoulders and sits there with them and looks around, and that. It's fantastic to see.
I'm Greg Milam, and I'm Sky's Chief North of England correspondent.
Welcome back. Right, let's get a bit more reaction, shall we, to that migration announcement from the Home Secretary today. We're joined now by the Conservative MP, Brendan Clarke-Smith. Good to have you on the programme, Party Deputy Chairman as well. So what's your reaction to what's been announced in the House of Commons today? Because so far, I'll be honest, we've had Lord Bilimoria and our panel who haven't been too impressed by the fact that you're trying to bring net migration down at all.
Well, I'm really pleased about it. I think it's something that we've recognised the problem. We've looked at what the figures are the last year and the revised figures for the year before. We've simply said that they are far too high. That's not just me saying that. That's not just people on certain wings of parties saying that. The Prime Minister said that. And we just think the numbers, it's too much. So we talk about illegal migration a lot and stopping the boats, but it's actually the net migration that we need to focus on as well.
Why is it too high?
Well, I think the problem here is you have to look at the services we've got, you have to look at housing, you have to look at the number of GPs we've got, the number of school places that we've got, and you have to have a balance. Now, we need the brightest and best. We want international students to come here, we want the doctors, we want the engineers, and of course we also want to welcome refugees from Ukraine, from Hong Kong, and nobody has a problem with that.
But that's quite a lot of, that's just rattled through quite a lot of what the net migration figures are, haven't you?
And that's part of the problem, Sophie, because when you actually break it down and do the number crunching, most of the people coming over do not fit in those categories. They're dependents. They're people who have come with people. Some people who've come on, say, social care visas have brought 4 or 5 dependents or so on, and that all has a cost. Now, we think that's too many, and that's why today we've had the announcement where we're going to tackle that.
Is it going to work? Because I'm old enough to remember when David Cameron promised to cut net migration to tens of thousands. Now it's nearly 700,000. So why should we believe you this time?
Well, exactly. I mean, people have got a right to question that and they want to know how this is going to work. But these are actually good, solid proposals. So we are simply not going to give those visas out to people who want to come over as dependents. So
we can judge you on that then. So if, by the next election,
absolutely.
if the numbers aren't coming down, then what voters have a right to
Absolutely.
turf you
So
out?
this time next year, the estimate is about 300,000. We think we should cut from the current figures. Now, that would actually cut it in half. Now, there are some people who like it then halved again the year after, and some want to get it down to the tens of thousands. But I think going from 675 odd to 300 odd is quite a big change in 1 year. So proposals that James Cleverly's outlined today, we've actually said how we're going to do that. It's costed, it's got the numbers in there, it's got the figures, it's got the research. I'm really confident it's going to work.
OK. Now, one of the points you mentioned there is you want to stop dependents coming over. So care workers, for example, bringing their families to the UK. Unison has said these cruel plans spell total disaster for the NHS and social care. They benefit no one. Estimates are that this is going to reduce the number of care workers coming to the UK. Those are figures the government is using as well. We're critically short of care workers. These are people who are looking after our elderly and vulnerable. Shouldn't we be encouraging people to come to the UK?
Well, absolutely. But, of course, Unison are there to protect workers, and you don't protect workers by pushing them into a low-wage economy. Now, we look at social care. They're some of the lowest-paid people in society to do an incredibly important job to us. Now, we're not saying, and this is one of the announcements today, that we're going to cut the visas there. Now, if you work...
Come on, you're saying that you're not going to allow them to bring over their families. You know that that's going to, make people less likely to come over. That's the whole point of the policy.
But that assumes that everybody that is coming over is actually going into that sector. We also
I'm just
look
talking
at
about just specifically care workers here.
But this is the health workers as well as the care workers. But we'll still get those people who want to come to this country. This is a fantastic country to live in. A lot of people want to come and live here.
Leave their kids at home.
No, but what we're also doing is we're giving them the option that if you are on that lower paid section of a job, the salary requirement, you're exempt from that. But we say as a pushback to that, we are going to have some limits. Now, that is one of the visas that has been abused more than any of the others, including the student visas that we're seeing, where people have started a course, they've brought several family members over and they've not finished it. Now, social care workers, of course, if they do meet that salary threshold later on, then, of course, you can bring family members over, and they may even have family members who meet the threshold themselves. But we've got to have a limit somewhere, but we've also got to train British people up and make sure that people who are without a job are going into employment.
What do you make of Keir Starmer's speech today, talking about not turning on the spending taps?
I'm still waiting for him to make some sort of announcement. He's not really announced anything. He's talking about not spending any money on anything. Then he's talking about not changing any of the proposals that we've done. Then there's this 28 billion that they were going to borrow, and now they're not going to borrow it. And I think people find it pretty uninspiring, really.
At the same time, though, at PMQs, he's talking about immigration. This time he's talking about not spending too much money. He's parking his tax on your lawns, isn't he?
Well, he's also talking about Margaret Thatcher, which has upset a lot of people. Now, it doesn't upset me. I think she's a wonderful woman who made a lot of fantastic changes to this country, but I think some people in the Labour Party, I don't think they quite see it that way. So I think he made a bit of a mistake there.
OK, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Sophie.
Coming up next on the Politics Hub, can Keir Starmer's economic plan lift the economy out of the doldrums? We'll discuss that next. Hello, welcome back to the Politics Hub. Now, anyone still waiting to be excited by Labour's plan for the country if they regain power was unlikely to be won over by the new watchword that was the focus of Keir Starmer's speech today, securonomics. But that slightly wonky term was eclipsed by a more basic and uncompromising message from the Labour leader that he's not going to turn on the spending taps if he becomes Prime Minister. Our political editor, Beth Rigby, reports.
The man who would be Prime Minister, here to set out a vision for Britain, but with a stark warning that the economy he'll inherit is in its worst shape for decades.
This is worse than the 1970s, worse than the recessions of the 1980s and 1990s, worse even than the global crash of 2008.
And here to spell out uncomfortable truths.
Anyone who expects an incoming Labour government to quickly turn on the spending taps is going to be disappointed.
A Labour leader who likes to say public services are on their knees, but today offering Labour supporters little in the way of a leg up when it comes to protecting budgets. I have a really simple question for you. Can you at least reassure them that you won't be cutting any departmental budgets after a general election, or are some spending cuts still on the table?
Certainly not in the business of cutting the funding, which is why the focus is so much on growth. What I would say, though, is that we must never forget that our public services need reform.
Starmer dodging on the question of post-election spending cuts. Labour's approach not that different to Conservative rivals, and in marginal Tory Telford, voters not convinced by either side.
And they're all the same, and they just do what they want to do. And my vote will still be undecided at the moment.
To be honest, I think you should get rid of them all and start again.
It's not just voters he risks turning off. Union backers dismayed by Starmer's caution too.
I think it's a mistake. I think investing in public services helps to grow the economy. I think we've seen what's happened of 13 years of austerity. Hasn't done anything for growth in the country.
Keir Starmer's already annoyed pockets of the Labour Party by praising Margaret Thatcher's sense of plan and purpose, as he put it, for the country. And today he doubled down, refusing to rule out further public spending cuts should Labour win a general election, raising the prospect of Tory-type austerity under a Labour government. Labour will set out its spending plans closer to an election, but the direction of travel clear. Labour backers might not like it much, but 20 points ahead in the polls, it's a risk Starmer can afford to take. Beth Rigby, Sky News, Westminster.
Well, a little earlier, I spoke to Steve Reid, the Shadow Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Thanks very much for being on the programme. So Labour have done a big speech, Keir Starmer's done a big speech saying effectively that a Labour government wouldn't turn on the spending taps if it won the next election. Some people might be looking at the state of their schools or the fact they can't get a GP appointment and thinking, don't our public services need more money?
Well, the Conservatives have broken our economy and they've broken our public services. That's clear to everybody. But the damage they've done in 14 years can't be cleaned up overnight. And Keir Starmer's absolutely right to emphasise that Labour will be responsible with the public finances. So we won't be doing what Liz Truss tried to do, which to borrow money for day-to-day spending. We all saw how that crashed the economy, how it led to rocketing inflation, mortgages, rents. None of that would a Labour government do. So what Keir has outlined is Labour has a plan to grow the economy. And as we grow the economy, more people get better paid jobs and are earning more. That will mean more tax revenue and business tax revenue into the exchequer. At that point, you can start to spend on the public services more generally. But specifically, Keir and Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, have pointed to some areas where there are particular loopholes in tax that we can fix, and then priority areas where that money could be spent. So, for instance, the non-dom tax loophole, which is where non-domiciled residents, people who are billionaires, live in our country but pay less tax than my hairdresser, will start to pay taxes. And from that, we can invest in the NHS and in schools.
We've spoken a lot about the non-dom talks over the last kind of few months or so.
Yeah.
Does it sound a bit gloomy? You know, are you guys like the Eeyore of politics now? Like no spending, no tax cuts?
No, it sounds realistic. And what this is based on is a plan to grow the economy. Now, if you look over
We've heard that before. Everyone says they have a plan to grow the economy.
Well, you can look at the numbers, Sophie, to be fair.
Yeah,
under this Conservative government, the economy has grown 50% less every year than under the last Labour government. That would have given the Exchequer today an extra £150 billion, either for tax cuts or public services spending or a mixture of both. Now, Labour has a plan to grow the economy. It includes changing planning rules so we can speed up planning, one of the biggest constraints on business growth, and supporting small businesses.
I want to talk about migration, because the government has today announced a new 5-point plan to try and reduce net migration levels, so increasing the minimum salary for skilled worker visa, banning care workers from bringing over their families as well. Now, I know you will want to get out your sort of lines that it's all the Conservatives' fault, they can't be trusted, migration levels are high. We'll take that all as read. We know what you're going to say on that. What I'm interested in is, what would Labour do? Do you agree with these plans or not?
Well, you can't get away from the fact that this is the latest in a whole string of Conservative Home Secretaries standing up there saying they're going to cut inflation and it goes up.
We've been talking about Liz Truss, we've talked about all these guys before. I just want to talk about Labour. Would you support their plans on net migration?
Well, some of their
today?
plans they've taken from us. So this crazy thing that they've had in place, where they offer employers a 20% wage discount to employ somebody from abroad to come into their country, perhaps with dependents, have to find somewhere to live, rather than use the money to train up a British person to do the job. That was insane. We've been calling for years for them to scrap that. Finally, they've done that. I think that will help the situation. But underneath that is a bigger problem, which they didn't address today.
So we've got your view on that bit. How about the idea that they want to stop dependents coming over for care workers, for instance? It's a big policy today.
Well,
what do you think of it?
That links to the point I was about to make, actually. The fact that they're having to bring so many people in from abroad is because they failed to manage the British economy properly. If you were training up British people to do jobs like care workers,
but what do you think about the policy for stopping
there wouldn't be an issue about bringing dependents in, because if you train a British worker to do the job, their dependents already live here. They already have a home here. You don't have to talk about bringing somebody in. Because the Conservatives have failed to manage the economy, they are facing this dilemma of whether to bring dependents in with the foreign worker. If you trained up a British worker to do it, there's no question about the dependents coming in the first place.
Do you support the idea of stopping dependents coming in for care workers?
Well, I support the idea of reducing net migration, and that is one of the areas where, I mean, we haven't seen the detail of what the Conservatives are promising. Are they going to stop it from tomorrow? Are they going to phase it in 6 months' time, in 5 years' time? Until I know that, I can't comment on what they're doing, but I'm making the broader point that we're only in this problem.
Would you do it? Do you like the idea or not?
I like the idea of it. It's when you phase it in, because what you don't want to end up with is care homes with no care workers and a lot of older people no longer being supported. But had they used that money to train up British workers, there wouldn't be an issue of bringing in people from abroad to do the jobs. And that's where they've gone wrong. They've mismanaged the economy, even in that respect.
OK. Margaret Thatcher, what's your view?
I'm not a great fan. My dad was one of the people that lost his job when she was Prime Minister and we had that big Thatcher recession. Keir Starmer... What
was your dad doing then? What was the...
He was a printer, a place called Oddham's in Watford, which closed down, as many places did during that period. There was no industrial strategy, just as there doesn't seem to be an industrial strategy today. But the point Keir was making about Margaret Thatcher was that, you know, love her or loathe her, she did make the weather politically, and not all prime ministers do that. It's fair to say I think Tony Blair did the same. Keir was making the point that the different approach he would have to running the government, a mission-led government, not the chop and change we've seen under the Conservatives, would lead to a more profound change. And we need that today, with the cost of living crisis hitting people in our country harder than anything they've experienced in their adult lives.
In the Sunday Telegraph, Keir Starmer said Margaret Thatcher sought to drag Britain out of its stupor by setting loose and natural entrepreneurialism. Your dad wouldn't have agreed with that, would he?
She set out to do that. Whether she achieved it is another question. I think you still can go to communities up and down this country that were hollowed out by Margaret Thatcher's government that still haven't recovered. And we need a proper, functioning, levelling up agenda today, which also Keir was talking about in his speech.
OK, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Right, let's talk to Salma and Andrew, shall we? We're going to talk about Margaret Thatcher a bit later, but I just want to talk about Keir Starmer's speech today, because, you know, it was big billing, a big speech from the guy who wants to be the next Prime Minister. What did you make of it, Salma?
I think the problem with Keir Starmer's speech today is that he's supposed to be the big change candidate, and people, want a different government. That's what the polling is telling us, certainly with Labour's lead. But what he essentially said today is that you're going to get more of the same. And that's a really interesting play, because it's almost as if it's a foregone conclusion that he's going to be the next Prime Minister, and as Andrew and I were discussing earlier, that he's just basically doing some expectation management about what's going to happen in his first term. What do you think?
Look, I think he needs to understand the reason he's in the lead in the polls. It's because people are fed up with the state of public services and the economy under the Conservatives. So saying I'm going to stick to that and you can't expect it to change is just going to mean that when he does win the next election, I think he will, all of that frustration that the public have got are going to transfer onto him, because people are looking at the NHS and the waiting list. People are looking at the fact their elderly relatives can't get care. They're looking at the fact their councils are collapsing around the country. They're looking at the fact there's a teacher shortage and so on. All around the country, every single public service is in disarray. The idea it doesn't need more money and he's not going to have to turn on the spending taps is delusional.
At the same time, though, is there an argument that there does need to be some expectation management and honest talking from both parties at the minute? Because currently we're spending more on debt interest than any department other than health. So even just to stand still or to get, the same level of spending, not making cuts that are penciled in,
I think that's true. I think the thing that would make his message more believable, therefore, is that... So let's say that he takes a piece about reform, saying that, you don't necessarily have to spend, you could make things more efficient. So what are the specific reforms that he wants to introduce, say, in the health service? What are the specific reforms that he wants to introduce as far as welfare goes? So we haven't seen anything that's tangible. And, it may be that Labour's waiting for the election, or as we get closer to the election, to lay some of that out. Perfectly sensible political tactic. But once he starts crystallising that, I think it becomes more believable, and he can actually counter some of the messaging that says he actually needs to put more money in, and that's the only answer.
There is no alternative to putting more money in. You can't get down the NHS waiting list when there's 7.8 million people waiting, when you've got 10,000 doctor vacancies, fewer GPs than you had 10 years ago, 40,000 nurse vacancies, huge shortage of dentists and so on. How are you going to do that without money? Reform doesn't solve that. Reform is not some magical word. It's just going, magic over there, saying reform. It's about money.
Good, doesn't it?
It sounds good. And it makes a lot of people go, yes, reform. Public services need reform. And everyone agrees they need reform. But as you said, what reforms? Which reforms? And how are they going to be funded? Because reform costs money up front. If you're going to change the way things work, it costs.
But also, just to take that magic point on, it's like we're going to have magical growth. But also, there doesn't seem to be a plan.
Everyone wants growth. Yeah, everyone loves the idea of growth.
It's sort of Liz Truss loved growth, as usual, about growing the pie. I mean, I don't know how you grow a pie, but if you're going to take that mentality, then what does lead to growth? What is that? I mean, we probably have a really good argument about what we think is going to bring growth in, but they come from two distinct political views. But I don't know what Keir Starmer is going to do to bring growth to the country.
Interesting stuff. Thank you both very much indeed. Now, the BBC only announced details of its latest cutbacks last week, but there could be more penny pinching ahead. That's after the Culture Secretary told Sky News she thought the planned 9% increase in the licence fee was too high.
I'm concerned about that level of rise, so it's something that we're looking at very carefully.
Yeah, the Prime Minister certainly gave the impression that it's not going to go up that much.
Well, we are concerned, to ensure that the licence fee is fair to people, particularly in this cost of living crisis. And also, we do need to support the BBC so that they can produce good content.
Right, let's bring in Salma and Andrew. What do you think? Is this a good place to save a bit of money, or are you a bit worried about the idea that there might be more cuts ahead for the BBC?
Well, I don't know if I can say this on Sky, but I actually think the BBC is pretty good value for money as
You're
well.
Allowed. We're very
we can have more than one good broadcaster, I think, in this country, and the BBC is also
We're secure
one.
enough in ourselves to
good.
allow.
Absolutely, that's good to hear. So I think the BBC is good value for money. I think this is an inflation-priced increase. It's not any more than that. This is where inflation was at the point where the BBC licence fee is judged, and therefore it should go up with that. I mean, for Lucy Fraser and Rishi Sunak to suddenly say, this is terrible, a 9% increase. My council tax went up 15% under a Conservative council. They weren't stepping in then. And that's a lot more than the licence fee. I think the licence fee is about £1.20 a month or something like that. The increase in it would be £1.20 a month. It's pretty small change. That's not going to bankrupt anybody when you consider everything else that's happened. Energy bills have gone up by 97% since 2021. Where's the great big bailout on that? Why aren't they, clamping on that. You know, France capped energy bill rises at 4%. So, you know, I can't really get exercised about, you know, an increase in people's money for the TV licence, which actually pays for quite a lot of things. You know, all the radio, all the TV, the website. I think it's fairly good value for money, to be fair.
What do you think?
I agree with your point that governments shouldn't pick and choose what they decide is a good rise or not. But, you know, the BBC is funded with the licence fee and, you know, it is criminalised. So if you don't pay it, there is, you know, a criminal sanction at the end of it, which is, you know, not necessarily true for absolutely everything else that you have in terms of
it's civil rather than criminal, actually.
Well, no, it's criminal because it's the campaign to sort of decriminalise the licence fee. The point is this, though. It's actually a much deeper question, I think, for the BBC. They can choose to negotiate with the government and decide how much it's going to go up. But it's a much more deep philosophical question about what is the purpose of the BBC? Why does it cost so much? Does it really fulfil its sort of duty in terms of public service? I'd be pretty happy not to pay for Mrs. Brown's boys, if I'm perfectly honest with you. Happy with a bit of Radio 4.
Or Robbie Gibbs' salary.
Or that's,
no, we really are getting controversial.
There'll be a lot of politics in that.
Here we go.
But that's,
Tim Davey. Yeah.
But it does point out exactly the issue, which is, you know, it's an entity that we are obliged to pay for. I'm also a fan of the BBC, but there are deep questions about how its funding model works and whether it can be reflected and representative of the entire nation and whether it does that fairly.
I'm putting that out there
Absolutely.
as the...
I pay for that, yeah, no problem.
The third parent for a lot of us, let's face it.
Yeah, so important childcare for many of us across the UK. Thanks very much indeed. Coming up next on the Politics Hub. 33 years after she left Downing Street, what is the perennial appeal of Margaret Thatcher for her successors? We'll discuss that next.
I'm Inzamam Rashid and I'm Sky's North of England correspondent, telling stories from this culturally rich region I call home.
It's going to become very similar to other places and lose its unique qualities.
It's steeped in history.
If the Taliban found your family, what would happen?
I think they're just going to straight away execute them.
There are issues of racism in all levels of cricket.
I was on the balcony a couple of times. I was nearly gone.
Football is a joy to watch, and when people are disappointed, you can feel the hate.
I just felt physically sick because I was like, that's really in my system.
We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world. Even before the pandemic, GPs were pleading for help. Government expects more face-to-face contact with patients in return.
Men, they want to force you doing something which you don't want to do, just because you're homeless and you're looking for a warm place to sleep.
We give a voice to communities often unheard and unserved from a region with a distinct history and global impact.
Hello, welcome back to the Politics Hub. Now, it's hard to know whether Keir Starmer realised the storm he would unleash with a little sentence praising Margaret Thatcher in a newspaper article over the weekend. But what is clear is that the Iron Lady has cast a permanent shadow on the political landscape ever since she left Downing Street 33 years ago.
I passed a local cinema, and it turns out that you were expecting me after all, for the billboards read, "The Mummy Returns."
Margaret Thatcher would not have ignored the meteorite that has just crashed into the public finances.
Mrs Thatcher would have expected nothing less.
I do believe that what I'm proposing economically is what I would describe as common sense Thatcherism.
Perfect song choice. Great song. Let's talk to Salma and Andrew, shall we? What is it about Margaret Thatcher, Salma?
I don't know, but, you know, she's not been with us for about a decade. So the thing that strikes me about this is really the lack of originality throughout politics. And you just saw it in the montage there. Every leader, apart from John Major, since Thatcher, has wanted to have a photo up with her because they want a bit of her golden stardust to rub off. But it just sort of goes to show that either you're hearkening back to the past, you don't have any original ideas, and you're not really a person of the moment. So I think not only has Keir Starmer obviously annoyed a lot of his Labour support and no doubt his backbenchers, even your interview with Steve Reid, I thought he was sort of supporting him through gritted teeth there. But it just speaks to that lack of originality in politics at the moment, and it's quite depressing. And also, political nerds like us, of course we know about Thatcher, we've probably traced all the speeches, we've heard all the conference speeches, but for the average voter, do they care? And I think the answer is no. I mean, I'm 40. I was at the sort of tail end of Thatcher's premiership when she was in charge. You know, why is it relevant?
It's interesting. I agree with you on Steve Reid. I thought he did look a bit uncomfortable, actually, when he was talking about Margaret Thatcher there. Keir Starmer, though, he doesn't say much without doing the polling, without thinking these things through. It will have been a strategy, won't it, to have mentioned Margaret Thatcher?
Look, it's a rather, I think, crude attempt to kind of go to Tory voters, oh, look, come to Labour, we don't, dissociate ourselves from Margaret Thatcher. But actually, as the John McTernan, who's very much on Starmer's wing of the party, a former advisor to Tony Blair, said today, actually, Labour's already mopped up a lot of that vote. Look at the polls. All that's left now, if you're trying to swim in the kind of remaining Tory vote, you're talking about Tory reform switchers rather than Tory Labour switchers. It's not going to work. And actually, you're just going to alienate your own base. And that was his advice, not somebody on the left like me. But I think what offended me in it was actually the inaccuracy of it. He said, Thatcher, what was it? It dragged Britain out of its stupor. Britain grew better in the 70s than it did in the 80s. We weren't in an economic stupor in the 70s. We had good growth, actually, throughout the 70s and and weaker growth in the 80s. So that isn't true. And to sort of hark back to this kind of myth around Thatcher, I think is quite damaging because actually a lot of the problems we've got today are her legacy. The housing crisis is her legacy. Low-wage, insecure work because she smashed the unions and deregulated employment rights. You look at the banking crash, which we haven't sorted out because, as you say, people didn't shift on from her legacy. We kept that kind of big bang, deregulate the finance sector, all be good. And actually, for the last 15 years, nobody's had any strategy on how to grow the economy. And look at where we are today.
See, the funny thing is, I think Mrs Thatcher is a bit more of a Madonna character in the sense that if she was around today, she would have reinvented herself to serve a purpose. So the problem is that what she did in 79 and what she brought through in the 80s, which obviously I completely disagree with Andrew on in terms of his analysis, but what she did, actually, she faced the challenges of the day. She was one of the first people that were talking about climate change in the 80s at the UN. So she really was aware, integrated, understanding, and a hard worker. I don't think that her kind of politician exists anymore, and that's why they keep grasping at her legacy.
I mean, that's kind of one of the reasons that you get frustrated with Keir Starmer, right? That you don't think he's radical enough, that he doesn't say what he believes in. I mean, I guess that's Margaret Thatcher,
there are points of crisis in Britain where you kind of need to shift our economic model. And we've been stuck since 2008 because we've had weak leaders. You know, you look at the procession of prime ministers, they're virtually forgettable. None of them have done anything memorable. And they haven't sorted out the economy. We're in a terrible state. And so we do need somebody to come in like an Attlee or, you know, like a Thatcher, I suppose, and have that big change. You know, of that kind of leadership, yes, but a completely different direction, because actually we haven't shifted out of this kind of dead economic strategy.
Right, if both of you are going to choose any prime minister from the past to, you know, come back, take over at the next election, who would you go for?
I'd go for Clement Attlee, mainly because he inherited a debt 2.5 times the size of today, nationalised industry en masse, tax the rich, and created the NHS. Knew to invest, not say, oh, we can't turn on the spending taps.
Salma?
Maybe Gladstone.
And why is that?
Oh, I like his social justice policies.
There you go. Perfect. Thank you very much indeed. A little bit of a history lesson there. That is it from us tonight. I will see you, however, tomorrow at 7 p.m. For more politics, hopefully more policy to be chewing through as well. Next up, though, it is SJ with the UK tonight, so do stay around for that and scan the QR code to catch up with all of the latest on the Hub throughout the day. See you tomorrow night, 7 p.m. Have a great evening.